Good evening, everyone. We're very happy to host you to this second lecture at ARCHIDES, the Faculty of Architecture and Design at Azam University. We're excited to have with us a distinguished guest speaker today, who will be speaking about architecture in the context of crises. I believe we all need to hear this today. We all are thinking of the many transformations that happen to us, to the way we work, the way we live today in the world under the pandemic, but also thinking how in the past, after the world wars, crises have shaped the world in a completely new way. Today's lecture is titled Crisis. What crisis? It sounds a little bit satirical. It sounds as if we can transform crisis. It sounds as if we can think of crisis as a catalyst for change. The context from which the lecturer is coming and lecturing today is Japan, and Japan has been notorious for dealing with a lot of crises, the world wars, earthquakes, economic trouble, etc. Also, another thing I think of a good parallel relevance is the fact that major transformations happened in Japan shortly after the World War. And before that, we had a European architect, Le Corbusier, no one else, who started leaving his mark and influence on Japanese architects, who in their turn responded in remarkable ways to modernity and to transformations post the World Wars. And today we're with Mr. Florian Busch, a European German architect who studied and graduated from the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London. He has worked for Toyo Ito for 5 years and started Florian Busch Architects around a decade ago, and has come up with a remarkable body of architectural design works and built works, from which he's going to be showing us hand-picked selection in which he will try to show us how he could or how we could explore the potential of architecture in the context of crisis. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Florian Busch, and I hope you'll enjoy the lecture. Florian?
Thank you, Wissam. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be a part of this lecture series. And it is also a very special and slightly weird experience to be speaking to an audience without any feedback, any live feedback. And I think that's part of the theme tonight already. It's part of the crisis that we are going through. And let me maybe start my presentation, and then we can have a look at some of the slides I prepared. And please let me know when you if I can go ahead. So I assume I can start. Crisis. What crisis? Now, as has been mentioned in the introduction, it of course has a satirical or hopefully not, but maybe if a cynical undernote. But that's absolutely not what I mean with this. In fact, I mean that crises differ in scale, in type, in quality, and there's always a different perception about crisis. The extent of crisis has changed. and with it, really how we talk about it. And if you look at this chart, you can see how more and more impactful, how more and more global these crises have become. If you look at the right side, there's one good crisis. If we wish, it's not a good crisis, but it's a good reaction. Is the Fridays for Future, and we see how widespread it has become. And of course, there's the currently all-encompassing global crisis, COVID-19. Now, 2020 has, of course, been a tremendously difficult time for all of us. The fact that this lecture is given here in a virtual space is a testament to this crisis. At the same time, it is also the very proof that there is opportunity in this crisis. And this theme of opportunity and a catalyst for change, as has been mentioned, that is the main topic I would like to talk to you today. A lecture without physical presence, something that would not have been considered a year ago, I guess, is now common practice. And at the same time, we are reminded that it is a slightly weird experience, and we're looking forward to when we can again do this in a physical context. Today, I would like to focus on, as I said, the opportunity that arises from crises. And like many of us, 2020 has forced me to reconsider, to reassess, and to recalibrate. So we're all kind of looking, in a way, at this reset button. I'm currently here in Japan, in the middle of Tokyo, a city that has seen many crises in its 400-year history. In fact, Japan has faced crises so frequently that they have shaped the culture of an entire nation. Thousands of years of recurring destruction have led to a culture of impermanence. And I cannot stress how important this concept is for everything in Japan, and especially its architecture. It's a culture that in itself is always in progress. Now, if we compare this to the Parthenon, which is perhaps the prime example of the Occidental culture that I grew up in, the Parthenon is a reminder of the height of a culture that has long disappeared. In fact, a ruin being maintained to stay a ruin, if you can see from this crane on the left. An image of an idea, the original imprisoned in the past. And if we compare this to one of the most famous cultural heritages of Japan, the Ise Jingu, the Ise Shrine, is arguably the most profound and beautiful interpretation of the concept of the original. It's a continuous cycle of and reconstructing the same building. The Naiku Shrine is, which we see here, is being reconstructed every 20 years in the ritual, and that goes back to over 1300 years. The currently occupied site is something very strange that happens now. If you look at this, you see the same building is being deconstructed and reconstructed alternately every 20 years. And something very strange that's happening. It almost looks like the building that is standing currently on the left feels imprisoned in the now. And it is at the same time set free by the absence on the other side, where the traces of the past indicate the future. Culture is in a permanent state of transition. The architecture itself has a very humble origin. It goes back to rice storages in the Yayoi period, when the Japanese became sedentary, and they had to be rebuilt frequently because the rice was sustaining an entire culture, and because of the humidity and the rice, the building itself had to be rebuilt. But perhaps more than anything, crisis in Japan means destruction, but regeneration always follows. So we've got these cycles. Walter Benjamin in 1931 said, the destructive character sees nothing permanent, but for this reason he sees ways everywhere. You can probably sense this almost aggressive search for opportunity and for change, for chance. Over 10% of the world's earthquakes happen in Japan, and or the surrounding region, as you can see here. This goes only back to 2008, and obviously in 2011 there was a much bigger earthquake. And typhoons, which are more and more frequent, are bringing disasters to Japan ever more frequently. If we look at the history of Tokyo, which goes back 400 years, within the course of 4 centuries, of these 400 years, some 50 major disasters and hundreds of fires keep erasing vast parts of Tokyo. When hardly any city in the world had 100,000 people, 100,000 people died in one fire in 1657. 1923, these are really just a few examples that I'm, the most prominent examples that I'm showing here. But 1923 is the famous Great Kanto earthquake, which destroys everything that you can see in red is completely destroyed, mostly through fires. Also brick buildings, which were in the late 19th century seen as the best protection from fire and were imported from the West, of course, did not withstand the earthquake. 1944, World War II, air raids over Tokyo completely erased the city. So the literal necessity of continuity, as we saw in the rice storage, and the constant need to restart after destruction lead to metaphorical, almost philosophical continuity, as you can see in the Ise Shrine, but also to spatial continuity, as we will see in some examples of Japanese architecture. So perhaps the best answer to the certainty of recurring disaster and recurring destruction is continuity of content. This is an essential sentence in Buddhist teaching, which goes back to these experiences. All things that have a form will break. Sen no Rikyu is probably the most famous tea master. Famously said, tea is naught but this: first you heat the water, then you make the tea, then you drink it properly. That is all you need to know. And precisely by not knowing or not having to worry about anything else in this moment, focusing becomes possible. Simplicity, but with it ultimate restraint, to enjoy the essentials. If we look at a tea house, the rules for the competition of a tea house are extremely simple and straightforward. The absence of the unnecessary in order to focus on the essential. The detail, as you can see on the beam in the center, on the window, etc., sort of celebrates this absence and lets you focus on the essential. Almost 10 years ago, I was standing with my team in the office, and we were holding shelves because the major earthquake about 200 kilometers from Tokyo struck. And it was a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. It's only referred to as 3.11 in Japanese because it happened on 11th March. And what you can see here is just an extremely intense destruction. Entire coastlines are shifted, completely devastated. And what I witnessed made me rethink the meaning of ephemeral. When I visited the site for a workshop with elementary school children in the area, I couldn't speak very well. By the time the ocean recedes, the level of the destruction becomes visible. Buildings have been reduced to toys. Architecture of an entire region has been reduced to rubble. As a result of the disaster that devastated this area, we were, FBA, my office, we were commissioned to design an exhibition for the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry to showcase the richness and the wealth hidden in Tohoku, which is the northeastern area that was devastated. What we proposed was a series of wooden poles, 45 by 45 millimeters cross section and variable lengths, raw wood. The original order is perceivable, but the absence really emphasizes it. You can see that something is weird, something is strong, but you also understand that something is missing. So what we did, we had those wooden poles, and we had almost built a 2.7 meter tall wall, so to speak, of those poles around it. And then as you walked inside, these poles became shorter and shorter so that you could sit on some of them, and eventually that things could be exhibited. So fragments of Tohoku, of the wealth of the artisans, of materials, were displayed in a disrupted order, and they became, so to speak, a collective memory. But in all this tragedy, the exhibition is one of optimism. The absence makes ways for discovery. And this is how we display these. These are all very traditional things from the area, and some were materials, some were just information posters. And Anna Winter met Mr. Hirata on the right, who passed away a few years later, who was one of the most famous hat makers in Japan. And the minister of economy came, and the bodyguards getting visibly nervous as they got stuck in the disorder of the wooden poles. And this man, only 8 months earlier, had been the unfortunate guy to make one bad news announcement after the other during the disaster. And what was always repeated was sotegai, which means it was an unexpected event that happened. And tragic response happened in the years after that. After several years and many political battles, a 14-meter tall wall, which was exactly the height of the tsunami at the time, was built for along several hundred kilometers of coastline. Now this wall creates another crisis, the voluntary imprisonment of vast areas behind a wall claimed to be big enough to withstand the next tsunami, as if we knew that the next tsunami was 14 meters. And the balance, the catastrophe through environmental destruction, what is happening here, versus saving from assumed catastrophe is ignored during the hard-fought battle to win approval. It's I think it's another crisis that they created here. A much more popular, and these things actually sold on eBay, a much more popular response was a book by the city government distributed to every household in Tokyo. Let's get prepared. With you get the idea why this is popular, because I mean, A, it's very useful, but B, it's actually great fun to read it. Now, when I received this book, it reminded me of another book, purely because of its color and its kind of format, which was published much earlier by Kaijima, Kuroda, Tsukamoto, 3 architects and their students. And they describe Tokyo as a city where typological diversity is responding in very pragmatic and often extremely funny ways. This made me think how prepared Tokyo actually is because of its inherent urban structure. Another book explores architecture as small pets, and the analogy is not completely off. What you see, what happens when destruction happens so often, and when a culture evolves with their mind set on things are not going to last, is that a rapid turnover becomes possible. So the buildings that you saw are very small, but they also have an average lifespan of today 26 years. For small houses, it used to be 7 years a couple of 100 years ago. What they show is the high degree of diversity the city fabric is made of, and these mass, the mass of these small buildings is everywhere. Yeah, it's in the center of the building. It's everywhere. And their small scale is, as I said, the cause and the effect for an ever-changing city. Now, a timely comparison to a virus, not the coronavirus, but the RNH1 virus strand is the most successful because it makes the most mistakes when replicating, thereby allowing for the quickest rate of adaptation. And that is completely analogous to an architecture that changes so often. There's a picture of of Shinjuku. You can see on the bottom right here is this one is the Metropolitan Government Building, and you can see how the diversity, the heterogeneity of the city structure, of the urban fabric, but also the small scale of those buildings, just a 5-minute foot walk away from these skyscrapers. This is a typical urban fabric, and this is not accidental. The in plan, the roads are all historically grown, and they grow with the topography, and the height of the buildings is regulated by building laws that allow for higher buildings near major roads and smaller, extremely low residential areas just behind them. And the zoning regulation becomes a diagram for the height distribution, and so here are these rules explained. It's all about not making too much shadow on roads or the neighboring plots. And what you can see all over these super low-rise residential areas are buildings of this kind of sort. Now that's arguably on the darker side. Not everything looks like this, but you get the idea. From my point of view, architecture is not about objects, but the space in between. If space is the emptiness between, architecture can be understood as a fluid, impermanent process. And this is a core concept of Japan's culture. Clear definitions are just one of many possible ways of perceiving the world around us. In 2010, the artist Nicolas Lelièvre documented a series, the gaps between buildings, and by overexposing them, actually showed the qualities between them. And these spaces then became occupied and showed also their messiness as extreme qualities. And this, dealing with the small scale of this, of the entire back street, so to speak, of Tokyo, as well as these urban gaps, has fascinated me for a long time. And it's also raised the question, what if architecture itself becomes such a lubricant between those kind of buildings and enabling the inhabitation of urban gaps? And in this context, this is, in 2010, we had the opportunity to build on a plot that was not much wider than an urban gap. And it turned out that this was the first time ever in history that this gap would be built on. It's in the center of, as you can see, pretty much in the center of Tokyo, and the scale is so big that there is not really one center. It's a polycentric city, but as you can see, it's in the middle of the urban ocean, and you can already see it here on the building. On this, you can see the building on this slide, and you can see the scale of it and how it really found this urban gap. This was the site when we first saw it. So you can see there's 4 car parking spaces. But what I saw was not the site as it's officially demarcated, which is this basically at, if you were to cut here, it's roughly that section, and then the question really became, how do we make use of the entire gap? As you can see, there's much space left around it, and can be wider than allowed. How do you bring light all the way down and throughout the building? So it became really an adventure to see how we can fit the building in this gap. It's 22 meters by 4.7 meters is the size of the plot, but we wanted to use much more of it. After many studies, we followed a concept of folding one surface and literally sliding it in there. And what you see, what happens is that we do have a much larger building, the perceived size of the building is much larger than it actually is. And the inside is nothing but a fold of the outside, as Michel Foucault once said in a different context, but I think it really started to make sense. So it's not just a simple fold, but it's cut like you can see on this diagram, so that we have a roof that is slightly slanted in order to maximize the space, and a facade that no one ever will see because it's too close to the other house. And the other side, now the effect that has is that in section you are always on one side of the fold, meaning that you get a perceived sense of privacy, even though the house is all surrounded. There's more glazed area than there is floor area. The structural layout, as you can see, there's a lot of reinforcement and here you see the real thing. It's basically a series of reinforced frames that are then held by crazily thin, almost in scale like toothpicks, massive steel columns. And the staircase was brought in one piece, and then everybody was happy when it actually went down. And there was only a 1 centimeter tolerance to fit it in there, so it's literally rotated in like a screw. And as you can see in this section, as I've mentioned, that you are always on one side of the surface. So if you are on the ground level, your neighbors have an idea that you're there. I mean, there are also frosted glasses to just bring in the light and not make you visible. But when you walk up one level, then there's absolutely no window in that concrete. So you're completely in a different world. So as you can see, it has some very interesting spatial qualities, and this picture is taken from the neighboring house. And if we go back one more, you see actually that we are borrowing that neighbor tree as if it were our own. And this is Google or Apple Maps or something like that, but you can see how the house is really in there. And interestingly, the actual floor is actually has a quite traditional tone to it. Traditional in the sense of Japanese traditional architecture, or the typical machiya, the townhouse, where the sites are often very similar, less than 4 meters wide and up to even 30 meters deep. These narrow houses have evolved around the idea that the inside and the outside are connected or interconnected gradients. From absolute form to relative formation, when we think about so beyond hierarchies, we move away from the idea of objects and move towards a continuation of the environment. This is the imperial palace near Kyoto, the Katsura-rikyu, and this continuation of the environment in architecture is a fundamental principle of Japanese architecture. And Bruno Taut discovered that. Tange obviously relished it. It is an architecture of the floor as opposed to the wall. It's an architecture of the horizontal continuation. And the empty betweens generate a space of non-hierarchical openness. If you can see that the building itself is really a part of the entire park garden. It was built between 1614 and 1658. And if you compare that to what happened, I mean, almost at the same time, slightly later, but they even overlapped in Versailles. If we juxtapose this with the other side of the world at that time, it's absolutism, the belief that man reigns over nature. It's an anthropocentric worldview, which turns out to be extremely limiting. And we can take that to the urban scale. Haussmann transformed Paris. How did he do it? He completely obliterated the old fabric. And time becomes a one-way street. He's never going to be able to go back. And it's 2019 Paris, but it could have been that it goes in the next direction if that had been, if Le Corbusier's plan had been accepted. And surely, or not surely, but likely that would have happened to Le Corbusier as well. We all know about Pruitt-Igoe and the crisis of modernity in the 70s. But again, I mean, Kyoto in itself is actually one of the few non-Japanese cities, so to speak, in that sense that it is borrowed from a Chinese grid, which imposes its rigid order. And the interesting thing about Tokyo is the only time that well, first of all, plans of the scale and even larger than what Le Corbusier and others did were of course also carried out for Tokyo, and many of them actually. But the only time the Cartesian order is imposed on Tokyo happens on water. Tange's plan of Tokyo for 15 million moves seamlessly from the land-given topography to the Cartesian occupancy of the sea. And there are many of those. I'm not going to go into detail here, but interestingly, in that time, Isozaki, who was in his 30s, then said such city planning has always ended in empty theory, and that is why cities have been kept alive. So even though he's one of the young metabolists, he's very wary about urban planning on this scale. This is a map showing Tokyo from around, or the area of Tokyo from around 10,000 years ago, superimposed with the current Tokyo. So you can see on the right that a lot of land has been claimed, and some of it became land mass naturally. But what is interesting about this is that the reality that such as infrastructure, the pragmatic is completely a pragmatic approach. It's not a top-down thing, and it's actually quite clever and opportunistic, in a sense wiser than these top-down planning master plans. And you can see what happens here is that this is used for the water arteries, and it's exactly following this topography. Japanese architecture gives priority to content. Content evolves in response to change, but form, once determined, is hard to alter. If we compare the the kimono to the corset, we can see that the corset restrains the body into an idealized form, whereas the kimono wraps the body as is, becomes part of the body in a process of adaptive formation. Now you can see, that obviously it's slightly less elegant on the right-hand side, but if we take the analogy to architecture, I think it's pretty obvious what happens when we try to force ourselves in corsets. This is a building in Roppongi, which is also very central in Tokyo, and it's about adaptation, but in a very intriguing sense. We are doing a sort of dealing with the eclectic context in a way as a chameleon maybe would. We are not denying the context, but we're using it in our own way. So the building, this is one of my favorite images because it's hard to see where our building actually is. It kind of takes all the mess that are around it and gives it a delicate order. The network of relationships with the surroundings, coupled with structural interior logic, establish an ordering principle. So are we wrapping the context, or is there a context wrapping us? And as you can see, we have a selective filter from the inside. And inside and outside sort of enjoy the same non-hierarchical relationships. And the city becomes part of the building, becomes part of the surrounding city. This is very close to Roppongi Hills, which Rem Koolhaas, in a very brilliant and sharp article, called a permanent house of horror for all. And it really, the main reason, and it's very sharp and right to say so, is that this is actually built for eternity, and it obliterated the tender and subtle buildings that were once there. And why are buildings like the Roppongi Hills so bad? We see them all over the world. This is Dubai. For the same reasons, most of these buildings are bad. It's not necessarily their scale or their appearance, as challenging as it may be, but their deliberate unwillingness to connect with the urban fabric and their perfidious pretense of being public, whereas they are absolutely not. The loss of public space is a crisis for which we will continue to pay a heavy price. As the dreams grow, architecture is in Tokyo in the bubble time architecture is becoming a liability. As you can see, 1990, 1991 is the height of the bubble. The market capitalization of listed companies, Japan versus the rest of the world. Japan at this peak is worth more than the rest of the world, which is, of course, a speculative value, but absolutely ridiculous. And things become possibilities. This is Kengo Kuma in his early years. This building is built in 1991 and sold in 2002. It was built as a Mazda showroom, and it was made 20 million write-off loss, and it became a funeral home. This is the only Eisenman in Tokyo. It was built in '92 and sold later with a loss of $26 million. And it became this beautiful senior nursing home. And just to give you proof, it still exists. I'm just going to walk quickly through these absolutely hubristic visions that were developed during the bubble years. We start small with the Tokyo Tower, 1958, Roppongi Hills, we just saw, which was realized. But then 2012, the Sky Tree also realized, and then it becomes quite interesting. These are unrealized buildings, but as you can see, we are now at 1,000-meter building in 1989, and we are. The next one is 2,001 meters, 500 floors, and these are all by the big construction companies. So they are not just student fantasies; they're actually engineered and all calculated very sharply. 2004. 2004 meters, 100 floors, and it would have housed 750,000 people. And now we are finally above Mount Fuji with 4,000 meters and 800 floors, and that would have housed 100 million, 1 million people, and it would be finished this year. It would be finished in 2020 had they started in 1990. Well, I think we can all agree that we are very happy that these stayed unbuilt projects. But some have, and more are being realized at a different scale around the world, as we could see in Dubai. And they're no longer part of the surroundings, but they're dominating and ruling over them. The loss of public space, as I said, is a crisis, and I'm not going to go into details tonight, but since the Olympics in 2020 fell victim to the pandemic, let me quickly talk about what happened to the stadium. In 2016, Tokyo bid for the Olympics with this stadium, which was the existing stadium from the 64 games. And it was perfectly fine. It was a beautiful stadium, but somehow it wasn't enough. And then a big competition was held, which Zaha won. But Zaha's proposal was deemed too expensive, and it's over a long process. She was basically kicked out, and then Kengo Kuma won another competition, and finally this stadium was built, which is aptly called the Hamburger, which was something that the entire process, no matter what you say about the stadium, Zaha's proposal, but this was really something that made me very furious. And we thought about an opportunity of what actually should have been done and how and what could have been done with the stadium, rather than building a white elephant, which will in a few years be to no use. We proposed a ship which would have been a stadium and which could have sailed the world after the Tokyo Olympics, which in hindsight, of course, with all what happened, seems kind of eerily prescient. You can see the stadium. But although this is just a fantasy, Tokyo has, from its beginnings, been the city of the future. And this is Tarkovsky in 1971, where he basically just rented a taxi and filmed vast of Solaris, and it's still to this day, it does seem like a city of the future. But it's unfortunately also going into a direction where we are seeing this. This is Panasonic's idea of a smart city just outside of Tokyo, where the smart cities obviously become a suburb, and despite their good intentions, they are, of course, prioritizing a completely anachronistic sense of convenience and a suburb. And it's based on a tabula rasa condition, whereas I think we could be much smarter. We could and should and must be much smarter. And this is, as an example, from the Netherlands, where the existing conditions and everything that is going to happen to us because of probably the most fundamental crisis that is awaiting us, that is climate change, how an architecture that is in the real sense of the word smart, reacting and responding, and how that could be. On a much lesser, smaller scale, we proposed as a competition entry in 2016 for an island in Lithuania, in Kaunas, a Lithuania Science Center. We proposed a building that would actually embrace the flood risk and make it an asset of the building, to actually change the building and change the experience of the building. So when it's almost most of the island is underwater, this building becomes even more fascinating. Tokyo has, this is the first ever high-rise building in 1968, and which prompted this absolutely amazing response. Where are we going to park all the cars if you bring so many people into the city? And I think this kind of meeting reality with a mix of humor and pragmatism is something that I think is a very promising response, and I hope that we will see more of this in the future to understand and mark and deal with the problems that are awaiting us. There is, of course, a crisis that's also in the making, and that's the population will become less and will become older. The projected peak is this year, and within the next 80 years, population will almost halve, and the population over 60 years will become close to 50%. But there's a good end to that, because we do know where to go when we get old, and for our last days, the last farewell, we also know we have a good place. But seriously and crucially, I think we are at a time where we will be facing more and more crises. And even though 2020 is hard, and for me to be talking to about this topic in the Lebanese context is, of course, brazen, and I'm in no position to be able to talk about this. But I think there is an opportunity, and in every crisis, and the original sense of the crisis does mean decision, and it means to separate, it means to decide, and it means also that we, if we embrace the opportunity, we can take it for the better and make it a better. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. We'll be happy to relay any questions the attendees, the audience have for Florian. If anyone wishes to make a question, And while we wait, I think I'm interested in the moment when you brought up Bruno Taut. Among all the references you brought along, I think Bruno Taut to me rang a bell, because at a certain moment where we see the meager exchange the West have had with Japan through maybe one project that, like Eisenman built one project in Tokyo. Also, I think, if I'm not wrong, Le Corbusier built one project in Tokyo, yes. If not two, maybe. But then, we know that this may have had its influence on Japanese architecture. But then this architecture has already been an architecture of simplicity. And if something caught the attention of Bruno Taut in his theoretical excursions, or maybe, I'm not sure if he built anything in Japan, if anything fascinated him was this simplicity in Japanese architecture. And he certainly wrote of the Kyoto Imperial Villa. No, my question is, when you mention that perhaps certain conditions of, if I understood well, ephemerality helps you fold in many different conditions within architecture. I'm reminded by the architecture of Kenzo Tange, when after the war he introduced multiple and complex notions in the Tokyo Bay project, for example. Simplicity there does not really exist. We see civic axes, we see the incorporation of multi-mobility possibilities, metabolist architecture, monumentality, meaning. There is this complexity in the architecture proposed there. And then he took this also to Skopje, where he introduced this post-war urban schemes also, and other schemes around the world. Now, what is happening, in Japan after in contemporary day Japan, contemporary urbanism in Japan? Is it still, after this history of simplicity in Japanese architecture and the different, as it were, marriages between modernism and Japanese simplicity, is it still possible to fold in complex notions, maybe for you, but also for other Japanese architects through your knowledge in the Japanese context? Is it possible to fold in a lot still, or you prefer to stay away from this complexity in folding urban contexts?
I mean, if I understand your question now correctly, is it that you're saying, is the simplicity still a theme, or is it the complexity, which don't necessarily mean the opposite? I mean, I'm just, because you started your question with an emphasis on the simplicity, and then you went back to the complexity. Can you formulate your question once more?
I'm just trying to tie back Tange's response to the need for a growing Tokyo, a sprawling Tokyo in his Tokyo Bay project, and that the fact that he has incorporated in his urban scheme multiple urban notions, and I mentioned, the civic axialities, mobility, metabolist, and monumental architecture. So all these notions are inherent from the complexity and the needs that come after a certain crisis. I'm simply wondering, is that still possible? And for you, as well as for other maybe architects, is it still possible to incorporate this kind of complexity in architecture on an urban scale?
Well, yes and no. I think, I mean, the times that we were witnessing, or not we, I mean, I wasn't even born, but I mean, if you think about the 60s, what happened there was that within a few years, the population, which was completely, I mean, depleted because of the World War, it increased by 270%. And so, I mean, these are times that they're not here anymore. And then what also happened, I think, what could happen again, but unfortunately is not, is that there was a collective effort, and the metabolists are probably, I mean, it's probably synonymous with that. I mean, that's not happening at the moment, where you can see architects, and not only architects, I mean, the metabolists, what really drove the entire movement was that it was not only architects, but it's also bureaucrats who kind of joined forces. So that is not happening at the moment. And I think that, I mean, there was a reason why those grand schemes of the metabolists were not realized. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, in Japan, I mean, a lot of them were in a way, or modified versions of them were realized around the world, especially Tange, but others as well. But literally, I mean, the few examples in Japan are completely minuscule, right? I mean, the Nakagin capsule tower, being maybe the most famous example. But of course there are others, but they're all small scale. So I think, unfortunately, for that right now, what I really envy, what I envy most about those times is this kind of collective, the understanding that the collective effort is the best to tackle problems. And I don't think we are there. I don't think, if we are, I think architects are not involved. I mean, if you think about the smart cities I was just touching upon, that's Panasonic. I can show you another example with Toyota, where, I mean, architects are either not present at all, or they're like relegated to a representative, I mean, brand name function.
Okay, I could carry further the question, but I want to relay some of the questions the audience are asking. Mr. Ramiz is asking about Burj Khalifa. You know, I think you triggered some objection here, because the question is whether Burj Khalifa can be thought as an important landmark or monument in the Emirates, in Dubai, and the fact that it had a certain effect on the perception of people of the Emirate through its monumentality. Can we not think of it as an avant-gardist project, for example?
Yeah, I mean, that depends on how you define avant-garde. I mean, I want to be very diplomatic here, but I think it's, of course, it's important, but it also, for me, begs the question: is size everything that is important? Is size everything that matters? And I mean, I was actually, a little bit proud at the time. I was working with for Toyo Ito on the hotel in Barcelona, and the Red Tower, and the sibling tower as an office tower you may have seen. And we won the best skyscraper of the year award, and we beat Burj Khalifa. But anyway, that's just an anecdote. But I was proud, not because necessarily we won, but because I felt justified, or I felt redeemed in a way that size is not everything that matters. Now, to go back to that question, of course it's important. Of course it's it's an achievement in terms of engineering, etc. But I think it's a little bit too vulgar to measure. I'm bigger, I'm higher, I think there are too many qualities that are not being embraced by these nations. They have extremely good qualities, cultural qualities, but why do you have to be the tallest? Why do you have to be the biggest?
If Dr. Mansour, if I may, I know we're coming very close to an end in our session, but first of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Florian very much on a very rich, lecture. There's a lot of ideas, and I would love actually to debate a number of those. But I would want to select one, actually, Florian. Something that attracted my attention when you mentioned a Chinese proverb, where you mentioned that all things will break. Well, that means that absence of the unnecessary with a focus on the essential. My question to you is, doesn't that put forward the politics of decision of who decides what's unnecessary and who decides what's essential? And what is the role of you as an architect in working through such politics?
Yeah, that's of course a very, very sharp question. And when I showed this, and in the context I showed it, it was much more innocent in a way, but I think you're absolutely spot on. And it is actually also a reason why Sennorikyo had to was forced to commit suicide in a way. Yeah, I mean, it's probably exactly that. What is essential, and as an architect, how do you decide that? Now, if you have, I think what happens to me a lot of times is when you deal with private clients, it's of course, it's of course a decision that you make together. Yeah? As an architect, you cannot, after all, you're not paying for it, so you cannot impose your will. But I think it's also very important that you stand your ground and come up with things. It doesn't, maybe it's not one, it's not, you don't have to boil it down to one particular thing that is essential, but I think there are parts that can be brought on the table to discuss, or maybe approach it from the other direction. What are the things that we don't need? What are the things that we can get rid of? Go down to where not only it's just not me, but it's others as well, and we all sit down. That's not only the client. That's all the involved parties of the team. Members of the team, meaning including the client, the engineers, everybody, that you actually sit down and literally boil it down to what is essential. So I mean, architecture is a very it's essentially a social process, and I don't think that it's up to me to decide what is essential, unless it's, of course, for me. I mean, unless it's my own project, my own building or whatever. But I think if we are talking about a much larger context where politics become involved, and a vast, maybe even a lot of people become involved, I think it's very important to boil it down with many involved to do that.
Indeed. Eventually, within the context of a crisis, obviously the society at large will always reconsider its the essential, right? In Lebanon, bearing on that particular example of we are in the middle of economic, let alone the COVID-19 crisis. The society altogether is re-questioning what is essential. And that's a prime, I would say, an important moment in the history of the society that will whereby we are expected to witness a shift in the whole market and its dynamics. Obviously, there is an important impact on architecture yet to be seen.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that 2020 is really is a year that forces us to think about these things. What do we need? What can we do without? And I mean, for you, probably in your context, the context of Lebanon, that's not only 2020. That's been going on for years. But 2020 on a global scale, you know, that's kind of the reset button that I showed in the beginning is a little bit hinting at that resetting in terms of what is actually what's all the stuff that we don't need, that we did because we were used to it, but we don't need it really. And I think in 2020 will look like nothing in years to come, or whenever. I mean, the climate crisis is going to force us to think about that in so much deeper ways.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you very much, Mr. Florian, for your answer. I leave it to Dr. Mansour. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
It looks like we don't have many more questions, and I think I'm happy to close it with Dean Abed's chat with you, and I thank you very much, Florian, for this beautiful lecture, and we hope to receive you maybe in person when the pandemic is over at ARCHIDES at Azam University. If that's suitable at the time. Thank you very much, everyone. And if Florian wishes to say anything before we close the session, the floor is yours, Florian.
Thank you very much, and it would be a pleasure to meet you in person. And well, let's hope that the times get better soon. But thank you very much. Thank you very much to everybody. And again, it is a weird experience, I have to be honest, to be talking to a camera, but I think it's also much nicer than if we didn't have the opportunity to do that. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Florian. Thank you everyone for attending, and we wish you all a good evening. Goodbye.